So in part 1, we introduced the idea that dragon riding and dragon hatching are genetic. There is an X chromosome linked dragon gene. One gene allows one to ride a dragon, and 2 genes allows one to hatch a dragon. And how the genes are passed on is based on a very simplistic Mendelian genetics model. We went through 200 years of Targaryen history, and then Rhaenyra came along. Oh, Rhaenyra! The number of rideable dragons in the world spiked from 6 to 18. And then dragons died off completely with no new hatchlings. We didn't see dragons again until Dany. So what happened? Well, let's look at the genetics of the Dance of the Dragons. Let's start with the Blacks and Rhaenys, the queen who never was. Now, as I mentioned last time, Rhaenys was likely a dragon hatcher and rode the dragon Meleys. Rhaenys marries Corlys Velaryon and has 2 children, Rhaena and Laenor, who are both dragon riders. As expected, they inherited a Dragon X gene from their mother and a normal gene from their father. Now, Laenor rides a new dragon called Seasmoke, so it seems his dragon egg hatched. Now, one might think that Laenor hatched the egg, but let's remember that Rhaenys is around the egg all the time, being Laenor's mother, so she could have certainly hatched the egg. Now, Laena rides the old Mount Vhagar. We aren't certain, but her egg may have hatched into the dragon Tessarion. Tessarion was a young dragon given to Daeron the Daring in the same year that Laena died, 120. As with Laenor, if Laena's egg did hatch, it was Rhaenys' doing. Now, Laena eventually marries Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince. The two have Baela and Hightower Rhaena. I call her Hightower Rhaena because she eventually marries a Hightower and has 6 daughters with him. Now, Baela is definitely a dragon hatcher and hatches the dragon Moondancer. But Hightower Rhaena doesn't seem to be. You see, the twins are both given eggs, but when they hatch, Rhaena's dragon is unhealthy and dies. This makes me think the egg was really hatched by Baela but didn't get enough time around her to incubate properly. Rhaena is given another egg, but is unable to hatch it. Near the end of the Dance with the Dragons, Rhaena is then given the dragon Mourning. So she's at least a rider. Of course, statistically speaking, having one daughter that's a rider and one daughter that's a hatcher is exactly the result we'd expect from a marriage between Laena and Daemon Targaryen. Each daughter has a 100% chance of getting Daemon's Dragon X gene and a 50% chance of getting Laena's Dragon X gene. Now, Rhaena and Baela both survived the Dance of the Dragons. Rhaena has 6 daughters, so it's almost certain that some Dragon X genes were passed on. Baela ended up very burnt and battered, but alive, and she ends up marrying someone from House Velaryon and having children. And now let's look at the genetics of my girl Rhaenyra and her children. Now, Rhaenyra first married Laenor. Now, Laenor is clearly gay, and so a lot of people think that her children were fathered by a guy named Harwin Strong. However, the truth is largely irrelevant, as she had all boys. Either Harwin or Laenor would be passing on a normal Y. Now, we should expect all 3 of her sons to be dragon riders, and sure enough, they are. Jacaerys rides Vermax, Lucerys rides Arax, and Joffrey rides Taraxes. Now, all 3 of these boys' dragon eggs hatched, which makes it look like they hatched them. But let's remember that Rhaenyra is around these eggs as well, and she could have easily hatched them. Now, Rhaenyra later marries Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince. Daemon and Rhaenyra had 3 children, Aegon III, Viserys II, and Visenya, who was stillborn. Now, we should expect Aegon III and Viserys II to be dragon riders, and Visenya to be a dragon hatcher. Aegon III does prove to be a dragon rider, riding Stormcloud. And again, this egg was probably hatched by Rhaenyra. Now, Viserys II's egg doesn't hatch, and we never find out if he's a dragon rider. And there's a very good reason why his egg doesn't hatch. He spends most of his life away from his mother. You see, Viserys was kidnapped when he was young and spends most of his early life in Lys. So those are all the blacks, so now let's take a look at the greens. So Viserys I marries Alicent Hightower, the titular queen from The Princess and the Queen. Now, Viserys claimed Balerion the Black Dread, so it seems he's a dragon rider, but not a dragon hatcher. They have 4 children, Aegon II, who is given Sunfyre, Helaena, who claims Dreamfire, Aemond One-Eye, who claims Vhagar, and Daeron the Daring, who is given Tessarion. So it seems we have 4 dragon riders, but no dragon hatchers. Now, Aegon and Helaena then have little Jaehaerys, Jaehaera, and Maelor. Now, Maelor dies pretty young, so we don't really know anything about his abilities, but Jaehaera and Jaehaerys' eggs hatch. So it looks like Jaehaera was an egg hatcher and hatched her twin brother's egg. Now if one looks at this family tree, something becomes quite apparent. Aegon, Aemond, and Daeron are all dragon riders, but they got a normal Y chromosome from their father. This would mean they would have to get their Dragon X gene from their mother. But House Hightower aren't Valyrians, are they? Well, we are given the description of exactly 2 Hightowers in our story. First, we have Illyri Hightower, who's silver-haired and handsome. Illyri is described as a younger woman who will most likely outlive her husband. Her husband, Mace Tyrell, is only in his early 40s, so it seems her silver hair is not from old age. The other Hightower is Rhaenys Hightower, who is said to look like Daenerys. Now, it's a small sample size, but the Hightowers do appear to have Valyrian features, and they wouldn't be the only house to resemble Valyrians. Members of House Dane, namely Darkstar, also look Valyrian. And here's the thing, there used to be dragons in Westeros before the Valyrians. The story of Florian the Fool includes a dragon. If there are dragons in Westeros, there must be dragon hatchers in Westeros. So it's not inconceivable that a Hightower would have a Dragon X gene. In fact, it would kind of make sense with regard to their scheming. The Hightowers were trying to get Viserys I to change his heir from Rhaenyra to Alicent Hightower's son, Aegon II. If Aegon II couldn't ride a dragon, there'd be little chance of this switch. The Hightowers' plans relied on Alicent being able to birth a dragon rider. So the appearance of Rhaenyra, Rhaenys, Baela, and Jaehaera explain why there was a boom in dragons. There were 6 rideable dragons before the dance: Vhagar, Dreamfire, Silverwing, Vermithor, Caraxes, and Meleys. Then Rhaenys hatched her children's eggs, Seasmoke and possibly Tessarion. Rhaenyra then hatched her egg and her children's eggs, Syrax, Vermax, Arax, Taraxes, and Stormcloud. And Baela hatched her egg and perhaps her twin sister's egg, Moondancer and Morning. Then Jaehaera hatched her egg and her twin brother's egg, Morgul and Shirkos. Now we are missing one dragon, and that's Sunfyre, the dragon of Aegon II. Now so far we've seen dragon hatchers hatch their own eggs, their children's eggs, or their twins' eggs. And this makes sense. All 3 of these relationships explain why someone would be close to a cradle egg. However, the eggs of all of our dragon hatchers, their children, and their twins are all accounted for. So who on earth hatched Sunfyre? Now it may be that Rhaenys and Rhaenyra were just hanging out with dragon eggs and were hatching them right and left. But if that were the case, why aren't there a lot more dragons than 18? Why are we only 1 egg shy? Well, I do have an explanation. Around the time in which Sunfyre would be born, there was this woman called Mysaria. Mysaria was a Lyseni dancer and was the paramour of Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince. In a seemingly irrelevant side story, Daemon takes a dragon egg and gives it to Mysaria when she's pregnant. The king, Viserys I, gets angry and asks for the egg back. Did Mysaria hatch Sunfyre? Did her fetus? The Lyseni do have Valyrian roots, and Sarah Targaryen did run off to Lys and got involved in the prostitution industry. Are Sarah and Mysaria related? Whatever the case, it's very hard to deny that there's something different about House Targaryen around the time of the dance. The 200% increase in the number of rideable dragons seems to be due to Rhaenyra and the other dragon hatchers. But why did healthy dragons suddenly stop being born? Well, Rhaenyra and Rhaenys were killed in the war, and Jaehaera was mysteriously murdered after being married to Aegon III. That left Baela as the only dragon hatcher in the world. Now, a few sickly deformed dragons were born near the end of the dance and after, including the short-lived Morning and the last dragon. I do wonder if Baela's condition led to this, or perhaps Baela and Hightower Rhaena always had trouble hatching dragons. After all, Rhaena's first dragon was sickly and died. Now, the family tree pretty clearly explains why no new dragons were born. The kingship passes to Aegon III, who is a dragon rider. But after little Jaehaera dies, Aegon III marries Rhaenyra Velaryon, which means that none of his sons will have the Dragon X gene, but all of his daughters will be dragon riders. However, there's no dragons to ride. However, those 3 sisters' genes are certainly still a factor. And then the overly pious Baelor the Blessed becomes king, and he locks up his 3 sisters and their Dragon X genes in the Maiden Vault. Now this is supposedly done so he wouldn't be tempted by them, but that doesn't make too much sense. He could have just sent them away. The Maiden Vault would prevent anyone from breeding with them. The sisters do eventually make it out, and Rhaena becomes a septa. Elena and Dana, though, do have children. Elena's descendants can be found in House Plum, House Longwaters, and House Penrose. And Dana had Daemon Blackfyre, who led the Blackfyre Rebellion. It should be noted that in this family tree there's no dragon hatchers, or even a possibility for a dragon hatcher. Now is probably the best time to talk about Brown Ben Plum. Daenerys thinks that her dragons like Brown Ben Plum, and he says it's because he has a little dragon blood in him. Tyrion even guesses that the dragons like Brown Ben Plum before Brown Ben even tells him. Could he be a dragon rider? Well, let's start out with what Tyrion thinks. Tyrion thinks that Brown Ben Plum is descendant from a younger son of Viserys Plum. Now, Viserys' father is in dispute, but Tyrion clearly believes it was Aegon the Unworthy. So it seems Tyrion believes that dragon riding ability can be passed on patrilinearly. Aegon IV had Viserys Plum, who had a Traveler Plum, who had Ben's grandpa, who had Ben's dad, who had Ben. Now we know that dragon riding ability cannot be linked to the Y chromosome because there are female dragon riders. Maybe dragon riding isn't linked to gender? Well, if that were the case, Ben would only have a 6% chance of having the dragon gene. Tyrion is almost certainly wrong about this one. But what about Brown Ben? What does he believe? Well, all Ben tells us is that a Plum married a Targaryen princess. Ben has a Dothraki mother, a Qohoric and Ibonese grandmother, and has some Summer Islander, Braavosi, and Dornish blood in him. Now what's interesting is the Black Pearl of Braavos is part Summer Islander and Braavosi as well. Now the Black Pearl's daughter was a legitimized Targaryen bastard, so she could be seen as a Targaryen princess. However, even if Brown Ben is descended from the Black Pearl, it still doesn't change the fact that his mother is Dothraki. Unless Ben is lying about something, or his Dothraki mother has a special past, I don't see how he can be a dragon rider. We know Ben is at least partly a liar, as he tells Dany that his grandmother told him the tale, and he tells Tyrion that his mother told him the tale. It may be that Ben is lying about everything. I'm guessing that the dragons like Brown Ben Plum because he's been secretly feeding them bacon or something. Meanwhile, back to the kingship. The kingship passes to Viserys II. Viserys II was that Targaryen who was kidnapped and then raised in lice. His egg never hatched because he was away from his mother. Now he marries a Lyseni girl named Lara Rogare. Now we aren't sure if Lara has any Dragon X genes or not. I'm assuming not. It only really makes a difference in that she could pass a Dragon X to Aegon the Unworthy, who could then pass one to Shira Seastar and the Black Pearl. However, for the rest of Targaryen history, it doesn't make any difference at all. Viserys, though, would definitely pass his Dragon X gene to Nerys. Now, we're uncertain who fathered Daeron II and Dornish Daenerys. It may have been either Aegon the Unworthy or Aemon the Dragon Knight. Which brings us to the Blackfyre Rebellion. Now, the Blackfyre Rebellion seems to be about whether or not legitimized bastards can be king, but it also seems to be about Dornish influence. Now, these seem to be two completely different ideas, but genetics explains why they're one and the same. Remember, Rhaenyra is double Dragon X, which means there is a 100% chance that her sons, Aegon III and Viserys II, would have the gene. Which means there's a 100% chance they would pass on the gene to their daughters, Dana and Nerys. Which means there's a 50% chance that each of the cousins would pass on their gene to their sons, Daemon and Daeron. However, Daemon marries Rohan of Tyrosh and Daeron marries Mariah Martell. This means that none of the sons would have the Dragon X gene. And Daeron only has sons. Daemon Blackfyre, though, has Calla Blackfyre, the wife of Bittersteel. And Daemon, assuming he got the gene from his mother, would have a 100% chance of passing it on to her. So the Blackfyre Rebellion could be seen as the survival of the Dragon X gene in the Targaryen line. Calla Blackfyre is the only shot the Targaryens have, and the Dornish could be seen as those who are extinguishing the Dragon X gene from the Targaryen line. In fact, they're not just extinguishing it in the Targaryens, they're stealing it for themselves. You see, the Targaryens and the Martells actually had a double wedding. While Daeron married Mariah Martell, Dornish Daenerys married Meryn Martell. Not that the Martells would have known that Daeron wouldn't have had any daughters, but the result was no more Dragon X genes in House Targaryen, but the possibility of a Dragon X gene in House Martell. So if the Martells might have the Dragon X gene in their line, could Quentyn be a dragon rider? Well, genetically, probably not. Even if we assume the Dragon X gene was lucky enough to make it down to the Princess of Dorne, and then lucky enough to make it to Doran Martell, Doran can't pass the gene on to his sons, only his daughter Arianna. If Oberyn were lucky enough to get the gene, he would pass it on to the Sand Snakes. If Elia were lucky enough to get the gene, she could pass it on to Aegon and Rhaenys, which may be why Rhaegar was interested in her. We'll get to that subject later on. But Quentyn's only chance to ride a dragon is to do what Nettles did. Feed it, and then mount it, which may be exactly what he did. And now we've completed 300 years of Targaryen history. It should be noted that throughout this history, the Faith of the Seven has been consistently against the Dragon X gene. The Faith was against the marriages of Dreamfire Rhaena. Sarah and Miguel were asked to be given to the Faith. The Faith supported the Greens over Rhaenys and Rhaenyra. Piety led to a maiden vault, and then the Faith was against Daemon Blackfyre. Not to mention the suspicious disappearance of Arya and Rala, the murder of Jaehaera, and the stillbirth of little Visenya. Now you may be wondering, if the Targaryen line lost its Dragon X gene, how did Dany hatch a dragon? Well, we'll talk about how Dany got her groove back, and young Griff, in part 3.